Israel has shown a consistent willingness to withdraw from territory in exchange for meaningful guarantees of peace. And that history has to be understood, at least if you're going to understand where the Israeli public is coming from when you wonder why is Israel moving to the right rather than to the left.
Now, this evening we will address the crisis in the Middle East since October 7, when Hamas attacked Israel and killed 1,200 people and took about 250 hostages, and of course has ignited so much mayhem and trauma across the Israeli public and the broader Jewish diaspora across the world. Now, you may recall that last month we held an event at the Intercontinental Hotel with Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago, and he painted a profoundly pessimistic view of Israel's strategic outlook, and he went so far as to call Israel an apartheid state, one that was committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. Well, tonight we will hear a completely different view, one that strongly praises and defends Israel's military campaign to eradicate the Hamas terrorists in Gaza. And who better to address this subject than our guest here in Australia this week, Bret Stephens. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist at the New York Times. He's been at the Times now since 2017. Before that, he was the deputy editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal and their foreign affairs columnist for many years. Before that, he was the editor of the Jerusalem Post from 2002 to 2004, as well as editor of the Wall Street Journal Europe's editorial and opinion pages in the late 90s and early 2000s. Now, whether one agrees or disagrees with Bret, I think it's widely believed, and this is not an isolated view by any stretch of the imagination, Bret is one of the world's most outstanding opinion page columnists. No question about it. His columns are always well written. They're sharp and to the point. He can be provocative, but he's also capable of understatement, which is an important art in any opinion writing, and he is always sound in style and substance. And with that, please join me in welcoming Bret Stephens.
Well, Tom, thank you for a slightly over-the-top introduction. I also want to say what a real pleasure it is to be speaking in Sydney for a second time. I had the privilege of delivering a lecture for the Lowy Institute 7 years ago, almost to the month. But I want to talk, since the topic is the crisis in the Middle East, I want to discuss it through two lenses, if you will, and really with a focus on the second one. So what are the lenses in which we can think about the crisis that has been unfolding for months, some might say for years and decades? One is a kind of a straight-up geopolitical analysis. The questions I keep being asked are, where does it go from here? When does it end? On what terms will it end? Can Israel achieve a decisive military success against Hamas? What about Hezbollah? What about the challenge of Iran? I hate questions like that. The physicist Niels Bohr, Danish Jewish physicist, once said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Prediction, I would sort of have a corollary to that line, which is not only is prediction difficult, especially about the future, but when you're asking for a prediction that might be validated or disconfirmed in a matter of hours, days, or weeks, you're simply asking for trouble. So I am a little bit reluctant to go down this path, although I think we're going to do it in the question and answer session, because the answer, of course, is I don't know what's going to happen. And anyone who says he knows what's going to happen is in some ways engaging in a bit of a fraud. Nobody really sees where it's going from here. The situation is exceptionally dynamic, and a lot of what might happen rests not on the will or whim of decision makers. It rests on events that are like the proverbial butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil and causing hurricanes in the Atlantic. If, for example, an errant rocket from Hezbollah were to hit a school or a fuel depot or a restaurant somewhere in northern Israel, creating a mass casualty event, then almost unavoidably there would be a war on Israel's northern frontier, which would dwarf in scale, scope, duration, and I'm sorry to say bloodiness, the one that we've seen on Israel's southern front. So, will that happen? The answer is I don't really know. So that's the geopolitics, and again, we'll talk about it when we sit on the stage. What I want to spend a few minutes doing is talking about this war through the moral lens, because not only are people interested in what's happening between Israelis and Palestinians in terms of what it means for the two parties and what it means for the region and the world, but there's extraordinary moral attention being paid and moral passion being invested in what's happening. So you have protests around the world, of course, here in Sydney, no less than in Manhattan and Chicago and London, on behalf of the Palestinians, or at least claim to be on behalf of the Palestinians. They're certainly anti-Israel. I guess Mr. Mearsheimer made this claim, but they certainly make it from the protests, that Israel is an apartheid state, which is to say an evil state, a racist state, conducting an evil and racist war with genocidal aims against the Palestinians. And some significant segment of Western publics believe this. On the other side, which is really my side, I also, to some extent, see what is happening, to a great extent, see what is happening between Israel and the Palestinians as a moral struggle. But to me, the important question is a question about anti-Semitism. And it breaks down into two component parts. The first part is a real question that the war might be causing anti-Semitism. That's to say that because there's so much passion being invested against what the government of Benjamin Netanyahu is doing or allegedly doing, that Jews the world over are in graver, under graver threats, in greater danger than they had been before. And there's something to this claim. We've seen incidents of anti-Semitism rise in the United States stunningly, and I suspect it's also true here in Australia, since the attacks of October the 7th. The Anti-Defamation League, which is an organization in the United States that fights anti-Semitism, noted that in 2013, not all that long ago, in 2013, there were just over 700 recorded incidents of anti-Semitism in the United States. These were incidents that rose to the level of being noticed, actionable, vandalism, violence, one thing or another, but about 700, so maybe 2 a day in a very large country. In 2023, there were over 8,000 incidents of anti-Semitism, and many of them occurring after the 7th of October, although the trend line had been moving up well before then. So that's one view of the war, which is that the war is becoming dangerous is making the life for Jews around the world more dangerous than it had been previously. I'd like to offer a contending hypothesis, which isn't that the war is causing anti-Semitism, it's that anti-Semitism is ultimately the cause of the war. I think this is a point that is radically underappreciated, at least in most Western discussions of what the conflict is about. In 1988, Hamas, which obviously we're all familiar with, Hamas published a covenant, a charter document describing what its aims are. And Hamas said, and this is in the terms of its charter, it says explicitly, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. It goes on to quote Quranic injunctions to say that the trees and the rocks will tell Muslims, faithful Muslims, O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come find him and kill him. It is one of the most aggressively anti-Semitic documents that the world has known since Mein Kampf, and I don't think that's an exaggeration on my part. And it forms part of a broader view because Hamas forms part of a broader movement. What is Hamas? Hamas is the Palestinian arm, the extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which took root in Egypt in the 1920s, and in fact, for a brief period of time, until a coup in Egypt a decade ago, was briefly in power. They're arms of the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the Sunni world. What is Hamas as well? Hamas is, for strategic reasons, but also ideological ones, Hamas is a cat's paw, an arm of Iranian power on the Mediterranean. And by Iranian power, I don't mean Persia in the traditional sense. I mean the Islamic Republic of Iran, which is and has been from the beginning replete with militant anti-Semitism as a foundational aspect of its ideology. The dimitude, a belief that Iranian Jews might have minor rights as a minority within Iran, but a belief that its role as the Islamic Republic is to treat Israel as the little Satan alongside the greater Satan or the great Satan, which is the United States. Now, I don't think you can understand the attacks of October the 7th if the lens you are applying to the conflict is a lens of a purely national struggle, okay? National struggles are ultimately struggles about territory, and they often or usually have relatively limited aims. There are all kinds of national struggles taking place everywhere in the world. And the way in which national struggles are typically resolved is by finding ways to divide the land or move populations so that the nationalities and the borders correspond. Often this is very ugly. Sometimes it's done by agreement. Any of you who remember the wars in the Balkan states in the 1990s, those were classic national struggles. Croatia versus Serbia, Serbia versus the Bosnians, Serbia versus the Kosovars, and so on. But the war that you can say started or continued or exploded on October the 7th is not a national struggle. It is a religious struggle. It is in religious ways, theocratic ways, that Hamas conceives of its ambitions against Israel. I had, for better or worse, as a journalist, the responsibility on a visit to Israel immediately after the attacks of October 7th. I had the opportunity to watch a 43-minute video that was compiled from captured GoPro footage, camera footage, that Hamas militants filmed during their raid into the Israeli communities, the towns and the kibbutzim on the edges of Gaza. So I had literally a firsthand view of what it is they did. And one of the sites, one of the visual images that I have, again, filmed by Hamas itself, and something that you can never unsee, is of a Hamas militant taking a garden hoe about this long and attempting to behead his victim by yelling again and again, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and an Allahu Akbar with every blow. It's a very, very difficult thing to watch. Another segment was captured recording of one of the Hamas militants who called his parents to say, "Mother, father, I killed 10 Jews. I killed 10 Jews." if you don't get that piece of context, I don't think you can properly understand what Hamas's aims are. If Hamas had not been stopped on October the 7th, the terrorism would have continued on the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th. And Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, has repeatedly said that the Palestinian deaths that they have experienced since October the 7th are worth it because the struggle is worth it. That is important for you to know. If Hamas has the opportunity or is given the chance to survive, it will perpetrate another October 7th on whatever date sometime in the future, because they see it not as a political enterprise or as a strategic effort. They see it as a theocratic, religiously ordained undertaking to rid what they see as Palestine from its Jewish occupiers. So you don't understand what Hamas intends until you have that piece of context. Now, part of the reason I think we've had in the West such trouble getting this point is twofold. I think the secular mind often has a very hard time appreciating the reach and ambition of theocratic aims. Why? Because we think of things, generally speaking, in terms of utilities. Does it make economic sense for us to go to war? Does it make political sense? We think about it in those kind of materialistic ways. But religiously based movements think about it in spiritual ways. They are motivated by things that we can hardly understand, a sense of glory, a sense of destiny, a sense of religious obligation. The other thing that I think we too often fail to understand is the nature of anti-Semitism itself. What is anti-Semitism? Anti-Semitism is not simply a prejudice against Jews. It is a prejudice against Jews, but it is a very particular kind of prejudice that in some ways is distinct, unique in historical experience. It can't be very easily analogized to, say, racism or other forms of prejudice. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, it's an ideology, and it's a political program. What's a one-sentence definition of anti-Semitism? I would put it this way. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that holds that Jews are uniquely prone to use devious means to achieve malevolent ends and must therefore be opposed by any means necessary. So one sentence, it's my own sentence, and other people have their own views, but that to me captures the nature of anti-Semitism. When Wilhelm Marr, a German pamphleteer, a journalist, coined the term anti-Semitism, he wanted it as a political program. He wanted to start something called the League of Anti-Semites. He saw it as a form of politics against Jewish interests. So when we ask ourselves the question, is anti-Semitism the same thing as anti-Zionism? It's worth noting that anti-Zionism is also a political program aimed against a specific set of Jewish interests. There is an analogy there. There is a consonance between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And actually, if you look at them more closely, the consonance becomes even more pronounced. So the anti-Semitic worldview, the belief that it is politically and ideologically or religiously necessary to fight the interests of the Jews, makes it very different. And it means that it has a very different place, I think, in the politics in the United States or politics here in Australia than other forms of bigotry do. There's another aspect of anti-Semitism which I think is important to point out. Typically speaking, racists act as if they are punching down. What I mean by that is the racist sees himself as the superior to the object of his bigotry or his contempt or his hatred. Anti-Semitism always presents itself as a form of punching up. The anti-Semite, however much actual power he might in reality hold against a Jewish victim or an object of his hatred, an anti-Semite always thinks that Jews have mysterious power. They control the world of finance. They control the world of media. Their lobbies in the United States put American power at the disposal of the Jews to further their agenda. So one of the reasons why anti-Semitism has found such a warm reception on the political left is because that idea of punching up, right, against power, against people who have power, is obviously an idea that's often cultivated in certain parts of the left. So what we're seeing now with anti-Semitism as the motive, in my view, of what Hamas did and how much support it's getting around the world is important to us. It's important for understanding how this conflict is being pursued, what the aims of it are, and how we should think of it, or really how we should not think of it. First of all, how is it being pursued? The question of genocide came up. The difference between a war and a genocide is that in a war, when one side surrenders, the killing stops. In a genocide, when one side surrenders, the killing begins. The Nazis were able to conduct a genocide against the Jews in the Second World War because the Jews had effectively surrendered. They were powerless. And that's when the genocide began. Powerless Jews were put on cattle cars and sent to places like Auschwitz. If Israel is to defeat Hamas, if Israel defeats Hamas, the killing will stop. But if the roles were reversed and Hamas had the opportunity to continue killing Jews, the killing would continue. And if Israel had surrendered to Hamas on October the 7th or the 8th or the 9th, it would have continued even more so. This is an understanding that most Israelis have. I think it's an understanding that's missing in much of the Western discussion about the way in which the war is taking place. Secondly, also, in terms of our understanding and our critiques of the war, I think the broad Western inability to see this difference and to understand the position that Israel finds itself in leads to advice to the Israelis or demands of the Israelis, which are not helpful to Israel, not helpful to the way in which the war is being fought, and not helpful to its ultimate outcome, including the interests of the Palestinians in an eventual state. The greatest tragedy that could unfold with this war is a war which concludes with Hamas in some measure of control. Because not only would it mean that the war would be repeated in 5 or 10 years' time on an equal or greater scale, but it would make it impossible for Palestinians to be freed of the theocracy under which they find themselves, at least in Gaza. It also means that the more that Israel is treated as a pariah by Western publics, the more Israelis feel less inclined to be amenable to some forms of compromise down the road, because the conviction takes hold among Israelis that what's really happening here is that the world is against them and they should just batten down the hatches. But the most important damage, I think, that is being perpetrated here is that in this single-minded obsession with the war between Israel and Gaza, we are doing a disservice to other people who are being subjected to mistreatment, abuse, civil war, genocide. And we are doing a disservice to our own democracies. One quick question. How many people in this room have heard of the Masalit people? Okay, since June of 2023, so happening right now, a community in Western Sudan is being completely annihilated by Sudanese Arab militias. A black community in Western Sudan, in an area not far from Darfur, is being annihilated. About 15,000 people murdered and millions of people displaced. And here in a room of probably some of the most educated people and the people in Australia most interested in foreign affairs, none of you have heard of it. It's worth asking the question of what the focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict means for dozens of other conflicts around the world in which innocent people are suffering. The second aspect that I think is worth discussing is the damage that our understanding does to ourselves, the damage that we do as free societies in the United States when we either fail to recognize anti-Semitism for what it is, or sometimes unwittingly, we incorporate anti-Semitic tropes into our own thinking. One of the enduring facts about anti-Semitism is that what starts with the Jews never, ever ends with the Jews. That the kind of thinking that anti-Semitism involves, particularly conspiracy thinking, single-minded focus and hatred on a particular group, always winds up doing more damage to the people who imbibe that ideology, imbibe that prejudice, than in fact it does to the Jews. You can look historically at the history of the Jews, and you can say what happened to Spain after 1492 and the expulsion of the Jews, what happened to Germany after 1942 and the decision to destroy the Jews. Anytime a democracy sets itself up against the Jewish people, it's the democracy itself that begins to suffer. Anti-Semitism is a symptom of a disease in society, a disease of the mind, a disease of liberal order that ends up destroying or at least harming that liberal order. Here in the West, whether it's in Australia or in the United States or Europe, Japan, democracy faces a series of existential crises. And some of those crises come from the outside. Some of them are emerging from the fact that in Beijing and Moscow and Tehran, and I would say Gaza, we are discovering a new kind of axis of authoritarian, theocratic, totalitarian states that find their interests are combining. And they threaten all of us around the world, which is why AUKUS is important to you, but it's why the Middle East should also be important to you. Free people, wherever they are, facing off against totalitarian or theocratic enemies, have common interests. But the threat is not just external. The threat is internal as well. The threat comes from the question which exists in every free society, which is this: can we, in these societies, sustain the habits of a free mind that make liberalism, in the broadest sense of the term, possible? Can we make sure that we don't give way, that critical thinking and critical analysis doesn't give way to conspiracy theories and prejudices and the belief that if only the Jews would bend this way or that, all the world's problems might be solved? This crisis affects us everywhere in the world, including here in Sydney. So what I would propose to you is that what we are speaking of when we talk about the Middle East is not a distant problem 5,000 or 7,000 miles, I don't know how many thousands of miles away from, many thousands of miles away from here. It is a problem that confronts you on the very basis of the political order that has made this country strong and free, and makes it a discussion worth having tonight. Thank you very much.
Just picking up from what you said initially about that, the last and only time you've been in Australia was with the Lowy Institute. You gave a very important lecture in 2017 on the dying art of disagreement. Yeah. And you're quite right. There were a lot of activists who wanted to cancel you. And it was primarily because of columns you'd written in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal on climate and energy policy.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And the argument was that you should not be able to speak about the dying art of disagreement because you you took a view on climate change.
No, as a matter of fact, it's because they tried to cancel me that I came up with the idea for the speech.
Right.
So I actually owe the attempted cancelers the theme that they offered me. And incidentally, I should note, I mean, my point in that speech was that to disagree well, you first have to understand well. And that you owe the people with whom you disagree the effort to understand their position as they see it. And my own views on climate have publicly evolved since then.
Sure, but nevertheless, I mean, the point is the John Stuart Mill principle that he who knows only his own side of the argument knows very little of it. Now, I think the conventional wisdom is that the crisis in the Middle East started on October 7 when...
The current crisis.
The current crisis, that's right. But the critics would say that this hasn't come out of nowhere. They would say that it was a consequence of Israel's decision to, these are the words of The Guardian, to lock the Palestinians into an open-air prison, and this was in large part a prison break. How do you respond to those critics?
Oh, it's wrong. That's just flatly false. I mean, there is now great controversy over the fact that Israel has just assumed control of Gaza's border with Egypt. Well, if Israel just assumed control of Gaza's border with Egypt, then how was Israel locking or single-handedly locking the Palestinians into Gaza if there was already a border with Egypt? I don't know how many people have visited Gaza here. I've visited Gaza dozens of times, okay? Gaza looks like most Arab cities, or of course, I'm speaking about before October 7th. Looks like most Arab cities. There are nice neighborhoods of Gaza, like upscale neighborhoods, and so the idea that this was an open air prison is wrong. First of all, because there was a border with Egypt. Secondly, because if you know a bit of history, or you've just been around for more than a few years. In 2005, Israel withdrew every settlement and settler from Gaza. They left economic infrastructure at the behest of the World Bank in Gaza. The reason what happened to Gaza is that shortly after Israel's withdrawal, there was a civil war in the territory. Hamas violently overthrew its rivals in the Fatah political party, in some cases by throwing their rivals off tall buildings, which is one way of resolving your differences. And even then, up until October 7th, Israel provided most of the electricity into Gaza, much of the water. So the idea that this was a blockade is simply not right. It's also the fact that Israel, I mean, this is perhaps difficult for an island country to conceive, right? But between 2005, Israel's full withdrawal from Gaza, and October 7th, there were 4 wars initiated by Hamas against Israel, with thousands of rockets that would have landed on civilian areas if they hadn't been intercepted by this technology called the Iron Dome. So if your neighbor is launching rockets at you continuously, having achieved power in your neighboring territory by way of terrorizing its own people, what is a country supposed to do, right? And I want to be careful here, but to the extent that I'm aware of Australian politics, when you had an immigration problem, right, you decided to put unwanted immigrants on remote islands in questionable conditions, right? I'm not critiquing that. My purpose here is not to critique Australian immigration policy, but Israel needs to be treated on a normative basis. That's to say, how would other countries respond in the face of similar kinds of challenges?
The critics would come back to you and say, Bret, that we're going to see more October 7 style attacks if the Palestinians don't have their own state or some degree of national self-determination.
Look, I'm in favor of a Palestinian state. Zionism exists, and I consider myself a Zionist. The purpose of Zionism is for Jews to have a state of their own, meaning they aren't ruled by others and they don't rule others, all right? So The ultimate purposes of Zionism cannot be fulfilled until there is a Palestinian state under some, whatever the arrangements are, a Palestinian state where people who don't want to be ruled by Israelis aren't ruled by Israelis. But it matters greatly whether the Palestinian state that comes into being is similar to the United Arab Emirates, let's say, or similar to Yemen. Is it a state that's going to be dedicated to improving the lives of Palestinian people and living peacefully with its neighbors? Or is it going to be dedicated to trying to destroy its neighbors? And in the case of Hamas, not just the Jewish state, but maybe the Egyptian state or the Jordanian state as well. So by all means, let's have a Palestinian state. But the question is, who will rule it, under what conditions, and whether it will threaten
Hamas
Israelis.
is not committed to a two-state solution, but the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank are, correct?
Nominally so, yeah.
Okay. Now, it is commonplace to blame Prime Minister Netanyahu for Israel's troubles in the current context. But isn't it true that the centre of gravity in Israeli politics has shifted further and further to the right over recent decades? And if you look at the extreme right-wingers in the present cabinet, like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, to the extent that the centre of political gravity continues to shift in this direction, does this mean that the war with the Palestinians is likely to continue for the foreseeable future? And that, if that's the case, Israel, as Mearsheimer puts it, faces a bleak future?
Look, there are a few points to make. I think in 500 years, if Jews, God willing, are around, the Jewish people look back and say, Netanyahu was a bad prime minister, a bad leader of the Jewish people who stayed around much too long and whose political selfishness led to the debilitation of the Jewish state on the eve of its grave disaster of October 7th. But again, let's contextualize a little bit. The government of Sweden, who most of us don't think of as a militant right-wing government, rules thanks to the votes of a very far right-wing party. In France, it's entirely possible that the French will be run by a prime minister from the Le Pen party in a few months' time when they hold elections. Right-wing populism is a phenomenon across the globe, and Israel is not immune from that. In the case of Israel, about 10% of the Israeli electorate voted for these extreme right-wingers. I think it's a great shame. I think they're noxious people who shouldn't be in power. Then again, about 48% of the American electorate voted for Donald Trump. So, okay.
But some of these right-wing members in the cabinet, and this has been documented not just by that South African submission to the International Court of Justice, they do highlight some remarks made by some of these cabinet ministers that are quite offensive about wiping out.
Look, a great American philosopher named Eric Hoffer once said that Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a Christian nation. Right? So there are bigoted scoundrels in the Israeli government. You know what? They're probably bigoted scoundrels in your government and in any number of governments. And this is important. Okay, in 1993. Under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, Israel went to sign the Oslo Accords, an effort to get Israel out of the business of ruling the lives of the Palestinians. In 2000, under Prime Minister Ehud Barak, Israel went to Camp David and made an offer of a Palestinian state. Now, the Palestinians rejected it out of hand. You might have said it wasn't exactly right, but the offer was made. In 2008, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert made another offer to Prime Minister or to President Mahmoud Abbas, again rejected out of hand. Israel has withdrawn proportionally from more territory than any other state that I can think of. Israel withdrew entirely from the Sinai Peninsula, which it had conquered in 1967, right, for the sake of peace with the Egyptians. Israel withdrew from most populated areas of the Palestinian Authority, of the territories, again, for the sake of a prospective peace. Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon, now I think to its regret. So Israel has shown a consistent willingness to withdraw from territory in exchange for meaningful guarantees of peace. And that history has to be understood, at least if you're going to understand where the Israeli public is coming from when you wonder why is Israel moving to the right rather than to the left?
You have argued that Israel has no choice but to obviously eradicate Hamas as an effective fighting force. And let me put to you the argument that a lot of the university student protesters make, and you've actually addressed this in one of your columns in the New York Times, quote, that thousands of Gazan civilians, many of them children, have now been killed, bombed in their homes or out of them. Now they face a humanitarian catastrophe in the form of medicine and food shortages, even starvations. So your critics would say, and these are the university students, how can this be justified?
War is horrible. You know, we just had the 80th anniversary of D-Day. D-Day, a good or a bad thing?
Good thing.
You think so?
Well, it helped liberate.
Well, the Allies killed 25,000 French civilians on June 6, 1944. I'm simply saying this because we look at the past and with these rose-tinted glasses, imagining that when our forces were at war against bad people, everything was rosy and no civilians got in the way. I mean, there's a TV series in the United States. Steven Spielberg, I think, produced it. I might be wrong, but it's called Masters of the Air. It's about the very brave bomber command that sent American B-24s to bomb German territory in the Second World War. And these were very brave young men. Many of them lost their lives in very daring daylight raids over Germany. But when the bombs fall in the TV show, no one pays attention to what's happening underneath. My late father-in-law, who only died a few years ago, remembers the firebombing of Hamburg in 1943, where 40,000 civilians were incinerated in one night. Who ordered that bombing? Winston Churchill, a national hero here. So what I'm saying here is two things. If you're going to understand war, civilians are killed, and it is tragic and wrong. But the reason we think of the Second World War differently is because of the question of to whom we assign fundamental blame for the conflict. We assign fundamental blame to the Nazis for initiating the Second World War, for conducting it so cruelly, and for requiring the response that they wound up getting from the Allies. Who is fundamentally to blame for the misery that's being inflicted in Gaza? My argument isn't that it isn't miserable and terrible. My argument is that Hamas is to blame for those deaths. In Ukraine, when bombs fall, the Ukrainian government sends civilians underground, right, to their metros. When bombs fall on Gaza, Hamas puts itself underground and interposes civilians. Hamas is using civilians deliberately as a strategy so that Palestinian casualties become diplomatic favors for Hamas. And that is exceptionally cynical, exceptionally cruel. And it is depressing that the cynicism and cruelty of that strategy isn't more forcefully condemned by countries that ought to condemn it.
Is there, though, a danger that Israel could get bogged down in a quagmire? Let me put this to you. This has just appeared in Foreign Affairs magazine overnight. This is General David Petraeus. Megan O'Sullivan, a former George W. Bush advisor in Iraq, and Richard Fontaine, you probably know all these people, senior advisor to the late Senator John McCain. They argue in Foreign Affairs that Israel's war of regime change, now I know it's not called regime change, but they say that's basically what's happening here, that Israel's war for regime change in Gaza is repeating America's past mistakes in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. So the question here is, what if Israel can't decisively defeat Hamas and Israel has no plan for running Gaza after the shooting stops?
So David and Megan are personal friends, and I have great respect for them, but they're wrong. General Petraeus's argument actually is that Israel is not occupying enough, right? That what Israel should be doing is what he called in Iraq the clear, hold, and build strategy, which is very, very manpower intensive and would require Israel to maintain a kind of a full mobilization beyond its capabilities, really as a small country, to occupy and hold portions of Gaza for an indefinite period of time. That's in fact what helped get the United States into a lot of trouble early on. What Israel ought to be doing is swiftly, not slowly, defeating Hamas. And one of the problems that I have with the Netanyahu government strategy is that it's like pulling off a Band-Aid very, very slowly. The operation, in fact, is notable actually for its lack of intensity, not the intensity. The second thing that has to happen is that Israel should absolutely not want to occupy Gaza over the long term. Israelis don't want it. Palestinians certainly don't want it. It would lead to an insurgency-style struggle that would be a disaster for everyone. The key is, can Israel defeat Hamas meaningfully as a fighting force and create conditions where an Arab mandate, I've written a column about this, an Arab mandate for Palestine, where Arab forces, say Egyptian troops or Emirati troops or Saudi troops, come in to establish conditions for basic security, which then can provide for reconstruction. And I would argue, I'm not against European states recognizing Palestine notionally as a sovereign state. But if you do recognize Palestine, then put your money where your mouth is and offer billions of dollars for the reconstruction, that economic reconstruction that Gaza will need.
All this, of course, this fight against Hamas in Gaza is taking place as there is increasing escalation of tensions between Israel and the Iranian-backed Hezbollah. So there's
Hamas is also Iranian-backed.
Absolutely, that's right. Even though Hamas, intriguingly, is Sunni Muslim and Hezbollah is Shia Muslim. How do you account for that, by the way?
Well, ideology is a powerful force, and sometimes it's able to overcome differences in theology.
Yeah, because the Arab nations...
Hating the Jews unites all kinds of people.
The Arab nations are predominantly Sunni, Sunni Muslim, the Saudis and whatnot. Why would they want to be part of any kind of post-war peace structure or governing structure?
Look, the real dividing line in the Middle East, as I see it, is not between Sunni and Shia. It's between the moderates and modernizers on one hand and the terrorists and theocrats.
Who are the moderates and the modernizers in the Arab world today?
Okay. Well, if you've visited the United Arab Emirates, you know that they're moderates and modernizers. Maybe not as we would like them to be in the enlightened West, but they are. Mohammed bin Salman, quite a guy, has nonetheless transformed Saudi Arabia in a way that makes it unrecognizable to what it was 15 or 20 years ago. The king of Jordan is a moderate and a modernizer. These forces are present in the Middle East. Sometimes the moderates and modernizers don't have power, but they could have power. I think the greatest moderate and modernizing force in the Middle East today are the women of Iran. And so sometimes they're in power, sometimes they're not in power, but they all have common interests. And Israel is on the side of the moderates and the modernizers. Again, I don't want to exempt Israel from all kinds of critiques. We could spend all night saying this and that about one aspect of Israeli policy or another. But if you're gay, if you're a woman, right, you'd rather live in Tel Aviv than in Gaza, right? You'd rather live in Tel Aviv than in Tehran. I mean, that's a good sort of heuristic for thinking about this distinction. So against the moderates and modernizers, there's this other coalition of theocrats and terrorists. And the reason the Abraham Accords happened is because people like MBZ in the United Arab Emirates realized that his real interests were more closely aligned to Israel and the West and what it represents than it is to other parts in the region, irrespective of religious
Well, they're worried about
differences.
Iran. And let me put this to you, because I put the same question to John Mearsheimer a month ago about Iran's hand being strengthened in this crisis, according to Mearsheimer. And your argument is obviously that Iran is aiding and abetting the Hamas and Hezbollah and obviously the Houthi rebels. But let me put this to you Brett, that Iran these days is surrounded by hostile Sunni states, and in Iraq and in Syria, they faced large Sunni insurgencies. This is a list until recently, dedicated to slaughtering Shia forces backed by Iran. And then there's the nuclear dimension. Iran has several nuclear-armed neighbours: Pakistan, India, Russia, China, Iran. Then there is the internal unrest in Iran. You mentioned the brave women in Iran. Now, many young Iranians are far more liberal and moderate than their parents, and they loathe the theocratic regime. So are you overlooking Iran's real weaknesses and limitations?
No, Iran is, in fact, in many ways, a weak state. It is like North Korea is a weak state, but weak states can do a great deal of damage. I mean, I've contended in other areas that the problem that we have now with China isn't that it's a rising power, in fact, that it's a diminishing power. And diminishing powers often tend to be more aggressive because they feel that time is against them, and so they try to play their hand through...
a bit like Russia in Crimea and the Donbass. Declining power.
Well, to some extent, that analysis is exactly right. That Russia has always responded to a sense of internal weakness with an effort at expansionary, aggressive foreign policy. But look, again with Iran, it is impossible to understand Iranian behavior merely as the function of a nation state pursuing rational national interests. The rational Iranian position should not be against Israel, right? And in fact, until 1979, Israel had few better friends in the Muslim world than the Shah, right? Than that traditional Persian monarchy. For a whole variety of reasons. Some of them go back to the fact that, Cyrus freed the Jews 2,500 years ago or whatever it is. Often because they had, at the time, a more clear common enemy in regimes like Saddam, the early years of Saddam's Iraq or other Sunni states in the region. The reason Iran behaves the way it does is because it has an ideology and a theology. And those are fundamentally militant and aggressive. I mean, for example, Iran without nuclear weapons, if you'll remember, just a few months ago, lobbed missiles at Pakistan, which has nuclear weapons. That's not a rational act. It's the act of a regime that is uniquely aggressive. And too much of our discussion, not our discussion here, but too much of our kind of collective discussion is about, well, why is Bibi doing this? Why is Bibi doing that? Isn't he a bad guy? Isn't he obnoxious, et cetera, et cetera? But Iran, the actual malefactor in the region, typically gets a pass. And what's most astonishing to me is it often gets a pass from the progressive left in America and elsewhere. How is it that the most misogynistic regime in the region should get this pass? How is it that a regime that hangs gay people from cranes should get this pass? It's one of the sort of mysteries of Western politics, the alliance of people who call themselves progressives with regimes like Iran or movements like Hamas that oppose violently everything they claim to champion.
Okay, now it's time for question time. First question over here. Thanks. Thank you. Zach.
Hello, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us today. I have a quick question. You mentioned that you believed in the two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinian territories. I was just wondering, in your mind, if there was a two-state solution, what would the Palestinian state look like in terms of borders?
Look, thank you for the question. My guess is it would look very much like Gaza and almost all of the West Bank. The question of borders, in my mind, is not entirely material. I mean, if you dropped Israel into, I don't know, Queensland, it would disappear in the bush, and the West Bank even. We're talking about very small territories here, and the possibility of adjustments is real. If the conflict were fundamentally a territorial conflict, it would have been solved by now. And you can, I don't know how specific you want to be in terms of what would happen, say, in the old city of Jerusalem or where the Palestinian capital would be, but a territorial conflict gets solved easily. You just draw a line, and if you don't get this border, maybe you get money or some kind of compensatory reward. The problem is the conflict is about existence, which is that too many Palestinians for too long have rejected any idea of a Jewish state in any territory. And Hamas represents the most vivid front of that rejectionism, but it's also present, or far too present, in too many parts of other more secular Palestinian politics. So how is it that we can, the great question is, how can we transform this existential conflict, which is really about 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, into a territorial conflict, which is more about 1967 and the question of borders? And my answer to that is, well, I don't know, but it can't happen while Hamas is the dominant political player. Just like you couldn't have a normal German state while National Socialism was its dominant ideology. It's the ideology and the mindset that has to change before the borders are determined.
Next question.
Thank you very much for your talk. You started by saying that you wanted to focus on moral issues, but during your talk, you never actually made a moral argument. So my question is, what does justify the murder of civilians?
Okay, well, first of all, the murder of civilians, nothing justifies the murder of civilians, except in this sense, okay? That if civilians are dying, or for some reason have to die in the pursuit of a cause that is just, that saves a greater number of lives, that ensures the conditions, or at least further ensures the conditions for a more peaceful world, then there's a justification, right? You might have asked similarly in the Second World War, well, the Germans have taken over Europe, great shame, but what are we going to do about it? Because any war that we will conduct in order to free France, Belgium, etc., from Nazi rule is going to result in unbelievable civilian casualties, right? And from a purely pacifist point of view, that's an argument to be had. Gandhi's advice to the Jews was take it. He actually wrote a letter to this effect, Mahatma Gandhi, that they should just sort of accept this. I think most of us, including me, don't accept this. Most of us do not accept political conditions in which the perpetuation of those conditions leads to even greater human misery. So I guess my argument is simply this. I would rather have an end of this horror, even if it involves horrors, than to have a horror without end. And the survival of Hamas in Gaza means, for the region and for the Palestinians themselves, a horror without end. Hamas repeatedly says it will conduct another October 7th. They say this quite proudly. So then you have to ask almost a mathematical question, right? Let's say 30,000 civilians are killed in this war. That's terrible and tragic and heartbreaking. But if the choice is between 30,000 now and 150,000 over future wars, I'll take the 30,000. And that's a heartbreaking calculation to make and a heartbreaking thing to say, but I would rather that it end now or soon rather than it continue forever.
Okay, next question. Thank you.
My question's about the Ukraine-Russian war. In the context of projected increased fighting over the upcoming European summer months, what do you think of the statement from the Secretary General of NATO saying that they want to clear the way for Ukraine to be able to join NATO as soon as possible?
The Ukrainians want a Western security guarantee, and the obvious candidate would be NATO. Russia has made it very clear that that's not negotiable. But the Ukrainians quite rightly, understandably, wanted their land back, and the Russians have made it pretty clear they're not going to give the land back. So to the extent that we have these fundamentally incompatible goals, does that mean that we're headed for a frozen conflict. And to the extent that's true, does that mean that all the Western aid that's going to Ukraine could be just prolonging the war, and the end result is more Ukrainians who are outgunned and outmanned could get killed?
I think the problem for the Ukrainians is they haven't received sufficient Western aid. Look, the way in which the aid has been doled out, on the one hand, has been sufficient to keep Ukraine from losing. It hasn't been sufficient for the Ukrainians to win. Why give them 30 tanks? Maybe tanks aren't the best weapon, right? Or why say we're going to promise you F-16s, but we're now 2 years into the war and the Ukrainians don't have F-16s? Why do we say you can have missiles that go 160 kilometers, but not 300 kilometers, which just allows the Russians to pull their forces back so that they're secure? We should be doing everything we can to help the Ukrainians win the war, or at least be in a position to dictate terms to the Russians rather than the other way around. If it's the Russians who end up dictating terms, then you're freezing the conflict and guaranteeing a future conflict. And sort of to the point of the earlier questioner, we should be very careful not to freeze conflicts with declarations of peace or ceasefire that merely create the conditions in which the war resumes in a fiercer way at a later date.
Next question. Yes. Yep.
Hi,
we can't see you.
It's Zoe Booth from
Yep.
Quillette. Thank you so much for your chat tonight. Back to the Israel topic. We know Israelis. We know that it doesn't matter if it's a left-wing, Rabin, or right-wing. Israelis will fight to the death for their country. They're not going to have another Holocaust. My question is about Western Jewry. I believe that Australia is still a majority Christian nation, but behind that, the fastest growing religion is Islam. If you look into Islam, into the Quran, there's a deep-seated issue with Jews, not just Jews, but other groups who don't want to become Muslim. What is the future of Western Jewry, of Jews, in an increasingly Muslim world, West?
Look, I'm not anti-Islam. I'm anti-Islamism, right? I'm against a religion being turned by its most radical actors into a political force. You can think of many religious traditions, including Christianity, which, when radicalized and politicized, have been bad news for other people, including notoriously or notably the Jews. And I don't like the thought of sort of looking crudely at demographics and saying, well, this religion is growing and therefore it's a threat. It's the question of what it espouses, what it believes. You can find in Israel Ahmadiyya Muslims, right, who live in great harmony with their Jewish neighbors in places like Haifa. So that's really the question, which isn't Islam per se or numbers per se, but the content and the aims of that side of a religious tradition. Now, the larger question you asked me is about the fate of the Jews in the West, and I reflect on this frequently, on this thought. In 1922, which is to say 102 years ago, the most influential man in Germany was Walter Rathenauer. The greatest scientist in Germany was Albert Einstein. And the greatest philosopher in Germany was Edmund Husserl. 3 Jews. 11 years later, the Nazis came to power. So there is a tradition in Jewish history, which goes back quite far, where our zenith in host societies has also been our precipice. And I worry about that. And I worry that October the 7th, or more accurately, October the 8th, which is when the reaction began, told us as Jews, I mean, to the extent that some of us in this room are Jewish, that the societies we thought were our homes, were welcoming places, saw us as equals, aren't really our homes. I reflect often on the fact that if Israel had existed in 1933, there would not have been a Holocaust, which is an important way of thinking about the state, the Jewish state, and the broader state of the Jews.
You've written in the New York Times a column, I think late last year, Bret, talking about every day for Israelis and Jews should be
October the 8th.
October 8th, just like We'll tell a story about the CIA after September 11th.
Well, right after September 11th, the CIA, our intelligence agency, although I always think of that Moynihan line, intelligence must not be mistaken for intelligence. The CIA, in its headquarters in Langley, Virginia, put a sign for its employees that say, every day is September 12th, which it was a way of saying the sense of purpose and mission and alertness and initiative that you felt on September 12th, right after the attacks, should inform everything that you do. And I do think that for me and other Jews living in the diaspora, October 8th was a great wake-up call. People have said, well, of course we were for Israel on October 7th. Who couldn't be for Israel? But the reaction since then by the Israelis has been so awful that nonsense. Okay, on October 8th, when Israelis were still being murdered, when Hamas had still had forces in Israel, right? I attended a rally in Times Square, New York, where the rally goers were cheering and celebrating the attacks on the Nova music festival. So there was already a large cohort of not just Israel haters, but anti-Semites who were cheering that day. And from what I could tell from the makeup of the protesters, they all looked like PhD students to me.
Now, we had an incident here outside Sydney Opera House. Do you remember that? Shortly afterwards?
Of course.
Okay, next question. Yep.
Hi, Bret. Thanks. I suppose I want you to imagine a world with a democratic, liberal Iran, secular in nature, pro-Enlightenment ideas, and the West. We have a progressive movement, multi-generational young movement at the moment in Iran that's eager for change. In the US and the West, in one move, you can diminish Islamism and the alliance between Russia, China, and Iran. What stops the US and the West to use its capabilities to work with and unite the Iranian opposition to enable this goal?
My experience with the Iranian opposition is that every Iranian claims to be the leader of the Iranian opposition. I mean that in a loving way, but it's a little bit like the American Jewish community, which has roughly 6 million leaders and hundreds of organizations, all of them claiming to represent it. So one important element to your question is, can the Iranian opposition come together? And some people, Pahlavi has done that, been sort of clear that he doesn't see a monarchical future for Iran. But there's so many groups in the Iranian business. Henry Kissinger once said, when I want to call Europe, what's the phone number, right? Well, when you want to call the Iranian opposition, who are you calling? Are you calling the MEK? Are you calling the Pahlavis? Are you calling this, that, or another group? The deeper challenge, however, is I don't think that any American administration has ever made the kind of effort that is required to illustrate that the struggle of the people of Iran against their oppressors is one of the great, if not the greatest, moral struggle of our time. In and of itself, because of the suffering that Iranians have experienced over 45 years of tyranny, but also for the broader consequences. In the 1970s, lots of people, and certainly when I was a kid in the 1980s, we all knew the name of Lech Walesa. We all knew the name of the Solidarity leaders. We knew who the refuseniks were in the Soviet Union, whether it was Sharansky or Sakharov or other people. We thrilled when Garry Kasparov was beating Karpov in chess because Kasparov was seen as the anti-Soviet guy. Right? There is nothing like that now when it comes to our support for the Iranian people. And I think that's a great, that's not only a great moral failing on our part, but it's a missed geopolitical opportunity, because a Middle East without that regime in power would be a much safer, saner, better Middle East, not least for the Palestinians, who could direct their politics in a better direction.
Next question. Yep.
Hi,
Got the mic.
thank you for the very insightful talk. My question is regarding your multiple comments regarding the destruction of Hamas.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate? Like, I can understand the destruction of Hamas as an organization, but clearly Hamasism, for lack of a better term, is quite entrenched within the Palestinian community, both in Gaza and the West Bank. How do you suppose Israel or the broader world deal with that when that ideology is still very, very appealing to a vast proportion of the Palestinian population?
You can't defeat ideologies, right? You can't. In 1946, there were plenty of National Socialists in Germany. Plenty of militarists in Japan. But what you can do is you can defeat the idea or the belief among a critical mass of the population that what that ideology represents is a wise way forward, which is to say, a conclusive military defeat of Hamas by Israel, which is a doable thing, okay? Difficult, but a doable thing, should persuade Palestinians that they might love Hamas, but another October 7th is something they will never want to do, and their children will never want to do, because the consequences are so bad. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Israel did not defeat Egypt's desire to destroy Israel. Israel defeated Egypt's belief that it could destroy Israel, and therefore it went for peace. Sadat decided that the strategy that his predecessor had pursued, let's mass our army, cross into the Sinai, defeat the Israelis, wasn't going to work. What could work? A peaceful solution. And so here's the question. Can you significantly defeat Hamas militarily as well as politically so that it cannot return to power, it cannot amass force, it cannot recapitalize its armed forces, and more importantly, Palestinians will not allow themselves to be governed again by a movement that has led them to misery? That's the issue. So you don't defeat the idea. No, we still haven't defeated white supremacy in the United States 160 years after the Civil War, right? But we've tried at least to defeat the idea that it would be a good idea for southern states to secede and have a civil war.
Next question. Got the mic? Yep.
So 2 questions today. The first one being, from Amnesty and many other news sites and humanitarian organizations, the background between October 7th ranges far before the October 7th attack, which is the ongoing colonialism, bulldozing of tents, mowing the lawn, and even the very establishment of Israel as being colonialist. This is purely what they're saying. Do you believe that Hamas's actions against the colonial occupation could be purely colonial and not exactly anti-Semitist? And is it inherently anti-Semitic to have a pro-Palestinian stance?
The term colonialism is sort of amusing to listen to in Australia. I'm sorry, but really, all of you are colonizers or the descendants of colonizers. And as far as I know, unless you have notes from Aboriginal people, what are you doing here? Leave. Go back to England or wherever. In fact, this is an important thing to note. The single oldest anti-colonial struggle in history is Zionism. Hanukkah, a Jewish holiday that coincides often with Christmas, is a story about a Jewish war against Greek colonizers. When Jesus was walking the earth, right, who was occupying the Jews? It was the Romans. That's why Pontius Pilate was there. Who called that land, okay? Who called it Palestine? Palestina is a Latin term. It is a colonial term. After the Romans went away, there was Byzantine colonization, essentially the extension of the Roman Empire. There was Mamluk colonization, Arab colonization. There was Ottoman colonization, Turkish colonization. And then there was British colonization, which Israelis, some of whom are still alive today, fought against in an anti-colonial struggle. So if you don't understand that history, that Zionism is anti-colonialism, because Jews have been continuously present in that land for over 3,000 or at least 3,000 years, you don't understand the conflict. Now, this isn't to say, okay, that other people don't have claims to the land. And as I said earlier, I am in favor of a Palestinian state, right? I'm in favor of it. But I'm not in favor of a Palestinian state that simply exists in order to destroy the Jewish state. Of course it is not anti-Semitic to be pro-Palestinian. What I just tried to argue a little earlier is that a Palestinian state would be the fulfillment of Zionism, would be in fact good for the Jews. But what is anti-Semitic is to claim that the Jews who have this unbroken history in that land, in fact, have no claim to that land. They have a sovereign claim that was granted by the United Nations in 1948. Okay, I don't think Australia got the UN or League of Nations certificate. It just came into being by taking it from other people and saying it's ours. But there it is, okay? There is a historic claim stretching back thousands of years, and there is a moral claim. Every Jew for hundreds of years has ended one of the most important nights on our religious calendar by saying next year in Jerusalem, right? In fact, few states have a stronger claim to a homeland, or few people have a stronger claim to a homeland than the Jews. And I think you don't really get the conflict or can understand the Israeli position until you get those points. And you had a follow-up from your
second question.
Yes, sorry. So my second question is linked to Mearsheimer's speech earlier. So many political theorists, such as Mearsheimer and even Hillary Clinton, have said that the Israeli right, including Netanyahu, have supported the rise of Hamas to power to divide the Palestinians on the basis of divide and conquer. So is Israel, therefore, responsible for the actions of Hamas?
So two points. It is true that Netanyahu, who I said earlier will be remembered in 500 years as a terrible, terrible Jewish leader, Netanyahu saw it as politically convenient to have Hamas in power in Gaza. And in that sense, he bears some responsibility for this. Right? There's no question that his culpability is serious. But I think it would be absurd to say, well, in that case, he's practically responsible for what they did on October 7th. Ultimately, moral agency rests with the people who conducted the killing. And we constantly, I think, dehumanize Palestinians by saying, well, it's not really their fault. They didn't really do it. You see, Netanyahu was supporting this and that. It's like saying, the responsibility for the Second World War lies with Neville Chamberlain because he had a foolish idea about appeasing Hitler as his national strategy. It was a foolish idea, but it doesn't make him morally culpable. By the way, all excellent questions and a credit to you and your school and your teachers.
Okay, just finally, absolutely, and we're grateful that you could be for both the John Mearsheimer and the Bret Stephens events. We are running out of time, but look, it wouldn't be appropriate if we ended this without talking at least about the state of play in American politics. Yeah. How do you account for the fact that we have in consecutive elections of Joe Biden and Donald Trump, both of whom are widely detested by large pluralities of Americans? How do you account what's happened here in the United States that has created these two candidates of the two leading political parties in the United States?
First of all, on behalf of all Americans, I apologize. look, there's a kind of a narrow answer and a broader answer. The narrow answer has to do with the system by which a small minority of partisans vote in primaries and therefore provide the choices for the rest of a country that wakes up from its stupor and its indifference to say, this is what's on the menu, because they didn't bother to wake up earlier and improve the possibility of a broader choice. The second point is more, I think, significant, and I wish we could end on a happier note. There is real democratic decay in the United States, as I think there is democratic decay in many countries. And it goes back to something that I spoke about at the Lowy lecture 7 years ago. Democracies live or die ultimately according to their ability to cultivate, nurture the habits of a free mind. And the habits of a free mind require citizens in a democracy to be able to entertain ideas with which they don't agree, to be open to the possibility that they might change their minds, to treat political opponents as fellow citizens rather than enemies, to have a sense of broad national purpose, at least around a few subjects, and to be able to distinguish narrow partisan issues with more important civic issues, to not make everything political, not to make everything that's political into a statement about your morals or your goodness as a human being. And all of this on account of a variety of forces, from lack of civic education to social media and the polarization it creates. All of this has taken a real toll on American political life, so that we find ourselves with a kind of one candidate who's mentally unfit and another candidate who's morally unfit. And that's where it stands. And I think what the only way we're going to get out of this isn't by tinkering with the system. It's going to end up with some kind of crisis, and what, at least in the States, we call a come to Jesus moment, right? Where we wake up and say, we can't go on like this. It is damaging whether you're a liberal or a conservative or a progressive or whatever. We ought to be able to do better. And one of the things that I'm trying to practice at the New York Times is to represent my side, but hopefully in a way that's halfway intelligent and not hateful, and that's open to the possibility that I might change your mind or that you might change mine. And
that's exactly what we try to do at CIS. What did Henry Kissinger say about the Iraq-Iran war in the 1980s?
May both sides lose?
Could you say that about the presidential election campaign? Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Bret Stephens.
Thank you.
That was great, mate. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.